small fee. You know, I'm not involved in this.
Can I ask you a question, please, on this?
Try and speak up, everybody, for the mic.
On this position, there's always been that little paragraph at the top of the page at the time. All the news that's fit the print. Now, to what degree does the Times choose to fit their press towards their own interests or to the neutral interest of conveying news to the world at large? Even in political cartoons, they can savage somebody in a nanosecond or elevate them at the same time.
That's true. You know, like theater pieces can be, you know, shut down by the Times theater critic who's now Ben Bradley, used to be Frank Rich, who was called the Butcher of Broadway. You know, but that is.
What neutrality
That
does
is,
the Times
the
do?
Times tries for neutrality. It makes every effort, it bends backwards. It's considered a Jewish newspaper, I think, by a lot of people because it was started by Jews, although it's run now by a guy who is an Episcopalian. His name is Salzberger. He is he calls himself an Episcopalian.
No.
I'm not involved in religion personally, so, but they do make an effort to be as neutral as you call it, or you know, not to take sides. In fact, I noticed that when the Pope was visiting here, not this one, but the one with John Paul, the Polish one, there was every single day on the front page there was a large picture of the Pope. And I think there's some bending over backwards, you know, to combat this notion of being Jewish, but in my experience, pro-Arab or Arab complain that it's too Jewish, and Jews complain that it's too, you know, pro-Arab. So
I mean, it has a distinct leftist bias. You cannot deny that.
Yeah, it's not.
Yes.
Well, it's written by intellectuals.
I have a different question. I have a question for you personally.
Yes, Kirsten.
Thinking about the publicity paper. Like, as a professional and an artist, and someone who obviously has a keen savvy about politics, what is it like to go through that experience where they pull something and you as an artist have to create something new? And you have a very limited amount of time to do it. How do you like quell, and you've obviously gotten behind the artist, and you're passionate about the work, and then you have to quell your passion for that artist's work, and then come up with a new passion within yourself after being angry with everyone.
Well, that's a very.
Anyway, it's a long question. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, it's a very kind question, actually. It's a very thoughtful question, Kirsten. Thank you. I can't say that I ever quelled my passion, and that was the problem. I mean, that was why I got fired by the second. You know, I got fired by the second. They couldn't fire me from the Times, but they could fire me from the Page. But you know, 13 years is, you know, huge record. I mean, no editor has done.
That's right.
Even half that long.
And you must have gone through that experience again and again.
Again and again. And, well,
you must have like a psychological
I guess I'm stubborn, you know?
You must have a trick you use in your mind, because at that moment, something that you use that helps you get through, like when they left you there that Friday, you had to come up with something that, you know, something happens in your head where you can keep going.
Well, I guess that part of it is that you know that it has to be done.
Right.
You know, I mean, when you have a deadline, the paper is going to be printed, you have to make that deadline. And I don't make all my deadlines in my personal life at all. I made the second deadline for getting this book done, which was much harder than I thought. I'd done articles, I'd written a lot of articles for the New York Times and the New Yorker, but I didn't know how difficult doing an actual book would be. I know many of you have done books, and you know what I'm talking about, but this required, you know, politics, office politics, and world politics, and artists and all these egos and permissions and history, and I wanted to get it right. And so far I haven't had anyone challenge it, but your question is good, and I simply knew that I had to come up with something, and I would just do my best, and I had to swallow. I sometimes simply had to swallow the notion that I could not publish what I wanted to do, and I would, you know, do the best I could. And occasionally there would be something that would go through that I thought would, like, you know, that Ralph Steadman did stuff that did
You were
work.
compromised. Anytime.
Yes, I had to. I mean, yes, but since it's every single day, 365, you know, it's not, you know, 5 days a week. So if somebody's assassinated on a Saturday, or you know, war starts, I would have to come in. And,
What about 2 weeks vacation?
I took vacations.
Were you the editor
But
at the time of the Judy Miller thing? And the editor of the op-ed?
well, I was called art director. It's called art director,
Can you
but
tell us something about the art that was used in?
well, that
connection
was
with any of those
that
objects?
was she and Chalabi were good friends, and that actually is international news. That isn't that's photographs. That's the, you know, just the facts, and the photos are used. Just like that. Yes, sir.
I wonder what you would tell. I have a friend who's a young artist who's very poor, had to drop out of school, and he would like to earn a living with his artwork. And it seems like the only thing that he sees an opportunity in is working with tattoos, which is not I don't think that's a very high level to aim for. But if you were to advise a poor person who had artistic ability and not a lot of money to go to school to get
Most of
graphic
my
design,
friends. Yeah.
what field would you consider going into as an artist?
Well, you know, tattoos aren't bad. I don't personally have any, but I don't think that it's a low form of art. I'm against it for, you know, hygienic reasons and others, but it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. In fact, Brad Holland, who's considered probably the quintessential op-ed artist, started as a tattoo artist. In fact, he couldn't even get a job doing the drawing of tattoos, so he was sweeping up in the tattoo parlor until they finally allowed him to do tattoos. But there are, you have to have a lot of chutzpah to make money as an artist, and I have so many as a visual artist or as any kind of artist, and that's a very big question. You know, a lot of artists become, you know, have become waiters, and you know, I was a waitress for a long time, and but you know, if you don't have a trust fund, you've got to figure out some way, and people are doing it. And others are sitting in their attics, and the people like Darger, Henry Darger, who died a few years ago and is now celebrated as great outsider artist. Nobody ever even knew of his existence until he died, and they found all this work in his you know, apartment, and he was never known in his lifetime.
Van Gogh.
Van Gogh wasn't celebrated at all in his lifetime. Yes, Mr. Paul.
Yes, so you told us about the censorship, you know, that was happening at the time, but tell us also about the reaction of the artists when they were told that, you know, you had to, you know, replace this piece of, you know, here, this piece there. Were they angry? How would they react?
Yes, very good question. And again, in the book, there are many examples, and I give reactions by artists. Some people, it varies. I mean, there are some people, some artists who are so glad to have their work published, you know, in a publication like this, and they know it will bring them a lot of kudos, and it does, that they'll do it for nothing, you know, which they didn't do. But except when I was told that I had no more budget in the middle of November for the rest of the year, 3 years that happened, I did. Anyway, that's the story. but artists would react with some would be very unhappy that they'd have to, you know, tamp down their work, or that I'd have to do that. You know, I often had to do that, say, with people like Kraust in England, or many artists. I had to, like Larry Rivers would say, okay, take a number 2 pencil and just, you know, and so I would do that. But I also, there were people who didn't, who refused. Occasionally, there's somebody like Brad Holland, who I just mentioned, who's a real star, and he did a piece with Johnson, who was a master of the Senate, and Johnson had the Capitol building as a hat, and I was asked to take out the Capitol building, you know, and the Capitol, which was the whole point of the drawing, because it was about Johnson was interviewed while he was getting a haircut, and this was, he grew up in the South, and it was also the way they cut boys' hairs with a bowl, you know, so it had a lot of meaning. And when the editor said, well, you can run the drawing without the Capitol, I mean, you know, yeah.
I'd be really upset.
Brad Holland refused, and he was right to refuse. But and then I told you about Brian Cronin and the corporate, you know,
Yes.
the cow, you know, the corporate welfare. He was very upset. He didn't want. I had to beg with him and plead, you know, and I didn't want to do it either, you know. But something had to happen, and I really wanted that idea to be used, and it was used, you know, very much watered down, without the milk, without the man, with, you know, but with no suction, you know, but it's still, maybe, you know, the idea came across. So to me, that was, you know, better than, you know, throwing in a photograph or something, you know. So it really varies. It's a very good question, and you know, it varies from artists who say, okay, or whatever, you know, and then they cry alone, because they put everything into it, you know, you just put everything into this work, and you're so proud of it. And then when the editor, you know, rips you off, like I had a, you know, a guy carrying missiles in a violin case, you know, which alluded to the mafia carrying guns in a violin case. And my editor said, well, you know, that's got to be a briefcase. You know, I mean, to take the whole point out of it, you know, was ridiculous. Well, I won that argument, you know. I taught, you know, I often was able to do that by saying, you know, there's no point. But then I couldn't always, and a lot of it depended on the personality. There were 6 of the 9 editors. A lot of it depended on the personality of the editor, and but I usually try to stay, you know, very calm and argue it, you know, as best I could before, you know, there was any screaming.
Did you sub for William Safire?
Oh, I did write an article for William Safire. If you're talking about the on-language article, I did. That was writing. I did write an on-language. I'm very much a lover of language, and I did write one. But he also, as a columnist, I you know, designed the page, and he was the only columnist who would call me as a political columnist on the op-ed page and ask me where his article would appear, where his column would appear that day. I said, Bill, people are going to read you. They're going to read you. They love you. You know, he was beloved as a writer, and so, but he always wanted to know, and so I told him. Yes. Meredith.
You've referred to yourself as strong, and clearly you're a very feminine woman. I'm wondering if you worked with predominantly men or women, and what role your being a woman played in your obvious negotiation ability for 13 years. Because you had something that was going for you. Obviously, your brains, your strength, and your femininity. Yeah, I wonder if you'd comment on that. And if you were male, could you have lasted 13 years?
I had a similar question.
Oh,
I think
you did,
it's
Carol,
extraordinary
as
what you
Meredith?
did, and I wonder how it was being a woman, especially starting in the 70s, right? You were,
Yeah, the
you
late
were so
70s,
young,
yeah, the late
and-
70s, yeah.
and there weren't many female art directors, I'm sure, at that
No,
time.
that's
Or
right.
art
In fact,
directors.
of the 31,
And-
there were, I did 3.
So it's pretty amazing. We should really talk about that a little bit.
Well, you know, it is an interesting question. I never thought about it, you know. I sort of am one of those people who just, you know,
Well,
went
for-
ahead. And
But I think there's a lot of young
But-
women that don't understand what
right.
that process
No, I know,
really
and you know, I did a little television program in San Francisco, and this is all they wanted me to talk about. They only wanted me to talk about what it was like to be a woman in the man's world. And it is a man's world. And newspapering, writing, it's a man's world. And the bosses were certainly all men, you know. Now, one thing I did, which I can't do now because I have, I'm going to have a TKR, a total knee replacement, March 15th, Ides of March. And so I can't wear high heels right now, but that's something I did just to create stature, you know, not for femininity, just to, you know, to be taller, you know.
Get a leg up.
Yeah, and you know, I had once, you know, there's one experience I have, yes, that will directly address this. Once an editor just, who I wasn't even working with, he just happened to, we were in proximity, and he said, could you look at this for me, dearie? And I said, well, certainly, dearie. And but I just never, I didn't think about that, but I know others did. I know that that's always a fact, and sexism is a simple fact of like, I am sexist, we're all sexist, and it was an issue, you know, that there were certain editors who, you know, were more interested in me because I was a woman, and others perhaps who resented the fact that I was a woman. And I got a lot of that as well. And that I was a woman and still, you know, would stand up for myself and not say, okay, you know. The first editor, the first op-ed editor who fired me, he had come directly from the Defense Department. He was, you know, that's a, you know, that's a click your heels deal, right? And I didn't do that. And I had, by that time, I had already, he was, I think, the 4th or 5th editor I worked with, and 4th. And he didn't, so I only worked with him for a couple of years because with him, and he simply couldn't take it. And I was warned. I was warned by other people that he was upset with me, that I was just too obstreperous. I was simply, you know, not taking orders. I didn't take orders because he didn't, you know, I once showed him a Ben Shahn drawing. Now Ben Shahn is a very, very famous American graphic artist and painter, wonderful. He's not with us. He's been dead for several decades. But I showed him this man I'm talking about. I showed him a Ben Shahn drawing of wrestlers because we had an article about wrestling. It's a wonderful drawing, and he said, well, you know that he didn't put enough detail in that drawing. You know, tell him to put some more detail. I said, well, you know, when I told him that this guy was a very big name and he's, you know, hugely important artist, he, I think, was pretty mortified, but I did get a living artist to do the piece, because there was no way that he would take this. And because Ben Shon's graphic work is known for its sparing quality, and that's one of its hallmarks. But that kind of thing just really, rubbed him the wrong way. And he once called me into his office and said, "I have someone I'd like you to meet." And he introduced me to this gentleman who does political cartoons, is the world's most widely syndicated political cartoons, but really can't draw well at all. He introduced me, and I looked at his work, and I said, it's great. I had known him because he was all over Europe, and I looked at it and I said that you're very important. I acknowledge your work, but you really don't do political cartoons. That's not what you're doing. And even though I was very gracious, and I thanked him and all that, it was simply, this man didn't get it. He didn't get art, but because the editor is king, and can go up to the publisher and say, I can't work with this art director. So the art director has to approve. You see? Now, actually, that editor was left under duress soon after that, but yes.
Yeah, could you tell us an interesting story about the subjectivity of different people, different persuasions to your drawing and your art? Like, for instance, Picasso, his work was used pro-war and pro-peace. And also, I would like your take on those covers, the cartoon on the New Yorker of Michelle and Barack in Arab outfits. How does that happen?
Well, that was actually
portrayed.
very Blitt.
How does that happen?
That was very Blitt. Well, the New Yorkers is much actually more liberal in terms of art. An article I did for the New Yorker was a tribute to Roland Topor, whose work was spread across double spread, and it was all naked women. The New Yorker is much more tolerant and very Blitt. Actually, my favorite very Blitt New Yorker cover was when it was 3 a.m. and Hillary and Obama were in bed, and Hillary and Barack, or Clinton and Obama, were in bed, and they were both reaching for the red phone that was ringing. I thought that was brilliant. But Barry's a wonderful artist, and they do. They get by with a lot more than the New York Times does, because the New York Times considers itself a family newspaper where people read at breakfast, and that is rule. That's the standard. That's changed. Of course, all of that is changing now. But that actually, the New Yorker is the only other publication that the New York Times respects traditionally. Now, it's the Wall Street Journal to some extent. They think most of the other publications, like New York Magazine or the World, exist because of them. By the way, if anybody wants a book, I have some books here. Yes, sir.
I have a question that kind of defers back to something you were asked earlier about holding this fit to print. The whole time you were speaking, I kept thinking of the book by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent, and this description of these authoritarian structures that exist in media, and then this concept of the editor that has this all-seeing or all-powerful ability to annex any story that doesn't agree with the establishment. But the way that they made it seem was that it was sort of deliberate, that it was a pro-establishment newspaper and that it is done quite consciously. But the way that it was presented in a way with your narrative suggested that it was more due to being absolutely politically correct and not wanting to insult any particular group or background or something like this. I just wondered how much of that thesis would you agree with, that there is these filters that sort of deliberately serve the establishment, or is the New York Times typically printing news consciously, or filtering news unconsciously, I mean, just so that they can maintain this politically correct approach?
Well,
Sorry.
you know, first of all, the New York Times is not a single entity. It
Sure.
is a bunch of people, human beings, excuse me. And every human being, you know, has his or her own agenda and tries to push it through. But the reporting is supposed to be not objective. And the editors edited and tried to make it objective. But there is always the filter. I mean, you know, you don't have that on the internet. Now, by the way, I didn't mention this, I don't think, but the op-ed page preceded by 3.5 decades the internet's blogosphere. So it really kind of prefigured the blogosphere by allowing outsiders into a prominent publication. And now anybody can write. And there are no editors. Sometimes there are, you know, some blogs, some, but it's quite different today.
How many of the drawings crossed your desk in a given day?
Well, I have to do 7 days in 5. So I would create Monday and Tuesday. I would do actually 2 pages, the editorial page and the op-ed page, and then Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday I'd start to double up so I get Saturday and Sunday done. But I didn't. I mean, people are always sending work, but I really can't tell you how many. I mean, but now they ask you to look at their web pages, which is what has replaced portfolios, the black portfolios that we all used to carry. Now we all have web pages, but you know, I really focused on the work that was being used that week. I mean, I hired people. I didn't, you know, accept stuff that came in, except for a few people who did work that I knew was very good. And if it was very good, I would keep it, and it was offered, and I would keep it in case I did have an art archive, an art bank that came in very handy when art was killed. You know. I thank you very much, all of you. I really. Yes, I have cards, and I also have books. If anybody wants